I never thought silence could weigh so much. Standing in my empty office at Riverside Development Group, the company I'd built from nothing over 25 years, I felt it pressing down on my shoulders like a physical force. The setting sun cast long shadows across the polished mahogany desk where I'd signed countless deals, each one a stepping stone to what I'd foolishly believed was an unshakable legacy. My name is Michael Harrison, and at 62, I thought I knew everything about betrayal. I'd seen it in business, watched competitors steal ideas, and witnessed partnerships crumble. But nothing had prepared me for this moment, the moment when you realize your entire life has been built on carefully constructed lies. The first sign came 3 weeks ago, buried in an innocuous email from our overseas subsidiary. Sarah, my CFO and wife of 15 years, had always handled our international operations. She was brilliant at it, maybe too brilliant, as I was starting to discover. The numbers didn't add up, showing mysterious transfers to accounts I'd never authorized. When I tried to discuss it with her, she dismissed my concerns with a practiced ease that should have set off alarm bells. "You're seeing ghosts, Michael," she'd said, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her tablet screen as she pulled up a different set of reports. "Everything balances perfectly. You're just tired from the merger negotiations." I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. Sarah had been my rock after Caroline, my first wife, died of cancer 12 years ago. She'd helped me raise my son, James, through his difficult teenage years, and had been by my side as we expanded the company internationally. But doubt, once planted, grows like a weed, sending roots deep into the soil of a marriage. I hired Marcus Chen, an old friend and forensic accountant, to look into the discrepancies quietly. His loyalty went back 20 years, to when I'd given him his first job fresh out of college. What he uncovered made my blood run cold, a sophisticated network of shell companies, all leading back to a holding company jointly owned by Sarah and someone whose name made my world tilt on its axis, Thomas Reeves. Tom Reeves. My best friend since college, godfather to my son, and the man who'd introduced me to Sarah at a charity gala 15 years ago. The same Tom who'd been my best man at our wedding, who'd vacationed with us in the Maldives just last summer, who'd held my shoulder as we lowered Caroline's casket into the ground. The betrayal wasn't just financial. Security footage from our Miami office showed Sarah and Tom entering the building late at night, when they thought no one was watching. The way they moved together, touched each other, it spoke of years of intimacy, not a recent indiscretion. "You should sit down for this part, Mike," Marcus had said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "The shell companies, they date back 14 years. Before Caroline's death." The implication hit me like a physical blow. 14 years. Which meant Sarah and Tom had been playing me before I'd even met her. Before Caroline's illness. The charity gala where we'd met, it hadn't been chance. Nothing had been chance. I'm not a violent man. I've always believed in solving problems with intellect rather than force. But in that moment, standing in my office with the weight of decades of lies crushing down on me, I understood why men kill. The rage that flooded through me was primal, a living thing that clawed at my insides and demanded release. But rage, I've learned, is a luxury that revenge cannot afford. And make no mistake, I would have my revenge. Not just for the money, though they'd stolen millions. Not even for the affair, though that cut deep enough to bleed. No, this was about something far more precious, time. They'd stolen years of my life, poisoned memories I'd held sacred, and possibly, the thought chills me even now, they'd stolen something even more precious. The photograph on my desk caught my eye, Caroline in her hospital bed, smiling bravely despite the pain, with Sarah holding her hand compassionately. Sarah, who'd been our rock during Caroline's final months. Sarah, who'd known about her cancer treatments, who'd helped manage her medications. My hands began to shake as I picked up my phone to call James. My son needed to know the truth about his stepmother. But before I could dial, a text message appeared on the screen. From Sarah. Working late tonight, darling. Don't wait up. Tomorrow's board meeting will be intense, get some rest. I set the phone down slowly, a cold smile spreading across my face. Yes, tomorrow's board meeting would be intense indeed. But not for the reasons she imagined. I had documentation of every transaction, every secret meeting, every lie. I had security footage, bank records, and witness statements. I had everything I needed to destroy them. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of their betrayal. If my suspicions about Caroline's death were correct, this wasn't just about money and infidelity. It was about murder. And as I sat there in the gathering darkness, I began to plan how I would dismantle their world, piece by carefully constructed piece. They thought they knew me, the reliable, predictable Michael Harrison. Always ethical, always controlled, always playing by the rules. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Because when you have nothing left to lose, the rules no longer apply. The office phone rang, shattering the silence. Tom's name flashed on the caller ID. The phone's glow cast an accusatory light across my office as Tom's name continued to pulse on the display. Each ring felt like another nail in the coffin of our decades-long friendship. I let it ring 4 times before answering, curious to see how well I could wear the mask of ignorance they'd forced upon me for so long. "Tom," I said, injecting warmth into my voice that I no longer felt. "What brings you to work so late?" His laugh carried the easy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Just reviewing some numbers for tomorrow's presentation." "Listen, Mike, I wanted to give you a heads up, there might be some questions about the Singapore acquisition." "Nothing serious, but..." I watched my reflection in the darkened window as he spoke, fascinated by how steady my voice remained while my free hand curled into a white-knuckled fist. 14 years of practice had made them excellent liars, but they'd unwittingly taught me their craft. "Actually, Tom, I've been meaning to ask you about Singapore," I said, keeping my tone casual. The timing of that deal seemed convenient. The microsecond of silence on his end spoke volumes. "Convenient? How so?" "Just thinking about Caroline." I dropped her name like a stone into still water, watching the ripples in my mind. She always said Singapore would be crucial for our expansion. Funny how it all came together right after she passed. Another pause, shorter this time. "Mike, are you okay? You sound different." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Never better. Just reflecting on old times. Remember that night at the hospital, when Caroline was so adamant about her new treatment plan? The one Sarah helped arrange?" The silence stretched longer this time. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, calculating probabilities, measuring risks. When he spoke again, his voice carried a carefully measured concern. "Maybe we should grab a drink before tomorrow's meeting. You seem nostalgic." "Nostalgia's a funny thing," I replied, running my finger along the edge of Marcus's report. "Makes you see old memories in a whole new light. Like that charity gala where you introduced me to Sarah. Was that your idea, or hers?" The sharp intake of breath on the other end was barely audible, but to my ears, it might as well have been a confession shouted from the rooftops. "Michael." His voice had lost its easy confidence. "I think we need to talk." "Oh, we will," I assured him, my tone still pleasant. "Tomorrow, in fact. Bring Sarah, she won't want to miss this presentation." I ended the call before he could respond, savoring the moment. They'd think they had hours to prepare, to coordinate their stories, to plan their defense. They didn't know that while we'd been talking, Marcus had been supervising the digital forensics team as they seized the backup servers. They didn't know about the midnight raid currently underway at their offshore offices, or about the sealed indictments waiting to be unveiled. But most importantly, they didn't know about James. My son's voice still echoed in my head from our conversation earlier that day, before I'd let Tom know I was onto them. "Dad," he'd said, his voice shaking with a rage that matched my own. "There's something you need to know about Mom's last days." James had been 19 when Caroline died, old enough to notice things but young enough to doubt his own observations. Now, at 31, he was a doctor himself, and his recent review of his mother's medical records had raised alarming questions. The progression wasn't natural, he'd explained, his medical training lending weight to what I'd already suspected. The sudden decline after Sarah started helping with her medications. "Dad," I ran the numbers. "The probability of that kind of deterioration without external factors is virtually zero." I pulled out the photo again, Caroline in her hospital bed, Sarah holding her hand. But now I saw what I'd missed before, Caroline's fingers, slightly curled away from Sarah's touch, her smile strained not just from pain but from something else. Fear. Suspicion. Had she known, in those final days? My computer chimed with an encrypted email from Marcus. The offshore team had found something, documentation of payments dating back to before Caroline's diagnosis, a detailed timeline that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just about the money. It had never been just about the money. The pieces were falling into place with a terrible clarity. Sarah and Tom hadn't just betrayed me financially, they'd orchestrated a long game that made my planned revenge seem almost merciful in comparison. Tomorrow's board meeting wouldn't just expose a fraud, it would unravel a conspiracy that had claimed my wife's life. My phone buzzed again, a text from Sarah, "Just finished up here. Tom mentioned you seemed upset. Should I come home so we can talk?" I stared at her message, marveling at her audacity. Even now, knowing I might suspect something, she was playing her role perfectly. The caring wife, the concerned partner. I thought of all the nights she'd come home late, smelling of Tom's cologne, and wondered how they'd laughed about my trusting nature. "No need," I typed back. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's a big day." I turned back to my computer, where another encrypted message had appeared. This one contained security footage from the hospital during Caroline's final week. I hesitated before opening it, knowing that whatever it showed would change everything. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m., and there was Sarah, entering Caroline's room when she thought no one was watching. My finger hovered over the play button as a terrible certainty settled over me, I was about to watch my wife's murderer at work. The security footage played before me in grainy black and white, but the truth it revealed was technicolor in its horror. My hands trembled as I watched Sarah move through Caroline's hospital room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. Each gesture was precise, calculated, a performance staged for an audience that was never meant to exist. The timestamp blinked steadily in the corner, 2:17 a.m. Caroline stirred as Sarah approached her four-line, and I found myself leaning forward, willing my past self to burst through that door, to stop what I now knew was happening. But history is a cruel playwright, and this scene had already been performed to its tragic conclusion. What struck me most wasn't the clinical precision of Sarah's movements, but the moment she paused to smooth Caroline's hair from her forehead, a gesture of tenderness that now poisoned every gentle memory I had of their relationship. How many times had I thanked Sarah for her devotion to Caroline during those final months? How many times had I held her as she shed crocodile tears at Caroline's funeral? "You won't believe what I found, Dad," James's voice cut through my thoughts as he burst into my office, clutching a stack of medical records. My son's face was ashen, his doctor's composure cracking under the weight of discovery. Mom's original blood work from before Sarah started helping with her care, I compared it with the progression charts. I paused the footage, Caroline's desperate expression frozen in digital amber. "Show me." James spread the documents across my desk, his fingers tracing the damning patterns in the data. "See these markers? The sudden spike in certain compounds. Dad, these levels don't just happen. Someone was introducing additional substances, carefully calibrated to mimic the natural progression of her disease. It was perfect, too perfect." The clinical language couldn't mask the rage and grief in his voice. My brilliant son, who'd pursued medicine perhaps driven by subconscious suspicions about his mother's death, had finally found the evidence to confirm our worst fears. "There's more," I said, turning the screen toward him. "Watch." Together, we observed as Sarah performed her midnight ministrations. James's medical training allowed him to spot details my layman's eyes had missed, the specific way she adjusted the flow, the careful measuring of additional substances. "She knew exactly what she was doing," James whispered, his knuckles white against the edge of my desk. "This wasn't amateur hour. This was premeditated," I finished. "And Tom helped plan it." I pulled up the encrypted files Marcus had sent earlier. Offshore account statements, property deeds, and a series of emails that painted a picture so dark it made me question everything I thought I knew about human nature. The conspiracy hadn't just been about money, it had been about replacing Caroline, about infiltrating every aspect of my life and company. "They met 3 years before Caroline's diagnosis," I explained, my voice hollow. "Tom introduced Sarah to the company through his consulting firm, positioning her perfectly. They needed her inside, understanding our operations, before they could kill Mom and take over everything," James completed, the words falling like lead between us. The truth hung in the air, heavy with implications. Caroline's illness had been real, but her rapid decline had been orchestrated. Sarah and Tom had merely leveraged an existing tragedy, accelerating it to suit their timeline. The perfect crime, hidden behind a mask of devoted caregiving and friendship. I found myself staring at my reflection in the darkened window, seeing for the first time how the weight of unacknowledged suspicions had aged me. But there was something else there too, a hardening in my eyes, a crystallization of purpose that transformed grief into something more potent. "The board meeting's in 6 hours, James said, checking his watch. "What's the plan?" I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "They're expecting a standard quarterly review. Instead, they're getting a murder mystery." My phone buzzed, another text from Sarah, "Just checking in, darling. You seemed distant earlier. Sure you don't want to talk before tomorrow?" The endearment made my skin crawl. I showed the message to James, whose expression darkened. "She's fishing," he said. "Tom must have spooked her with whatever you said to him." "Good," I replied, feeling a cold satisfaction. "Let them spend the night wondering, plotting. It won't help them." I turned back to my computer, pulling up the presentation I'd prepared. It wasn't the one Sarah and Tom were expecting, the one filled with quarterly projections and acquisition targets. This one told a different story, built slide by devastating slide. But as I finalized the details of tomorrow's revelation, a new message appeared in my inbox. The sender's name made my blood freeze, Caroline Harrison. "That's impossible," James breathed, leaning in closer. "That account was deactivated years ago." My cursor hovered over the email. After everything we discovered tonight, I thought I was beyond being shocked. But seeing my dead wife's name in my inbox, on tonight of all nights, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. "Open it," James urged, his voice barely a whisper. The subject line read, "What you still don't know." The cursor blinked accusingly against the stark white of Caroline's email, each pulse a heartbeat of possibility that threatened to shatter what remained of my worldview. In all my years of business, through countless negotiations and confrontations, I'd never felt my hand tremble as it did now, hovering over the mouse. James's breath caught as I clicked open the message. The timestamp showed it had been scheduled years ago, set to deliver on this exact date, as if Caroline had reached across time itself, knowing precisely when we would need her truth most. "My dearest Michael," the email began, "if you're reading this, then my suspicions were right, and I'm no longer there to protect you." The words swam before my eyes, Caroline's voice echoing in my mind with devastating clarity. Even now, 12 years after her death, she had found a way to pierce the elaborate facade of lies that had surrounded me. I've arranged for this email to be sent if certain conditions were met, specific transactions, account activities that would only occur if what I feared came to pass. Sarah isn't who she claims to be. Neither is Tom. Their connection goes deeper than you could imagine, back to the Meridian Project. My hand froze on the mouse. The Meridian Project, our company's first major international venture, the one that had put us on the map. The deal that Tom had orchestrated, that had seemed too good to be true. They approached me first, Caroline's message continued. 6 months before my diagnosis. They wanted access to the company's environmental impact data, claiming they represented interested investors. But I recognized Sarah from somewhere, a connection I couldn't quite place until it was too late. By then, the cancer had started, and things were moving too quickly for me to prove anything. James gripped the edge of my desk, his knuckles white. Mom knew, he whispered. She knew and she tried to warn us. The email contained attachments, ancient files that Caroline had buried deep in the company's servers, set to unlock only under specific circumstances. As they opened, a horrifying pattern emerged. The Meridian Project hadn't just been about real estate development. There had been chemical trials, unauthorized testing in regions where oversight was lax. Sarah hadn't just been a financial expert, she'd been a chemical engineer before reinventing herself. The cancer clusters in the Meridian development zones weren't coincidental, I breathed, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. They were testing grounds. And when Caroline discovered this, they gave her a death sentence that looked natural, James finished, his voice raw with fury. They perfected their method on those communities before using it on Mom. The scope of the conspiracy unfurled before us like a poisonous flower. Sarah and Tom hadn't just killed my wife, they'd used our company's resources to develop the very means of her murder, testing it on innocent communities under the guise of development projects. My phone buzzed again, Sarah, her timing exquisite as always. Darling, I'm worried about you. You're not yourself. Let me come to the office now, we can talk before the meeting. The tenderness in her message made bile rise in my throat. How many times had she used that same concerned tone while precisely measuring the substances that would kill my wife? How many nights had she slipped away from our bed to meet Tom, both of them laughing at the elaborate dance of death they'd choreographed? Dad, James said, his voice steadier now, there's more. Look at the last attachment. Caroline's final gift to us was a comprehensive database, names, dates, chemical compositions, and most damningly, a video file. The footage showed Sarah in a laboratory, years younger but unmistakable, working alongside Tom as they developed their deadly cocktail. The timestamp matched the early days of the Meridian Project. All this time, I said, my voice barely a whisper, we thought we were building homes, creating communities. But they were using our company as a front for something far darker. The first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the sky outside my office window. In 3 hours, the board would convene, expecting their usual quarterly meeting. Sarah and Tom would arrive, prepared to defend themselves against what they thought was merely financial misconduct. They had no idea that Caroline's ghost was about to shatter their carefully constructed world. My phone lit up one final time, Tom calling again. But this time, when I answered, I heard something in the background that made my blood run cold, Sarah's voice, sharp with panic, and the sound of papers being hastily shredded. Michael, Tom's voice was desperate now, all pretense gone, whatever you think you know, whatever you're planning for the meeting, we need to talk first. There are things you don't understand, forces at play that are bigger than all of us. I let the silence stretch, savoring his discomfort. You're right, Tom. There are things I didn't understand. But Caroline made sure I would, eventually. See you at the meeting. As I ended the call, a new email notification appeared, this one from an anonymous source, containing a single video file. The preview thumbnail showed Sarah entering a laboratory late at night, but not the one from years ago. This footage was dated last week. They hadn't stopped. The Meridian Project hadn't been the end, it had been just the beginning. Dawn broke over the city like a fever, painting the sky in hues of wounded amber and bruised purple. I stood before the boardroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, watching my reflection shimmer against the metropolitan backdrop, a ghost overlaid on steel and glass, much like the specter of the man I used to be, now forever altered by the weight of terrible knowledge. The evidence was arranged before me with surgical precision: Caroline's files, the laboratory footage, financial records that traced a constellation of corruption across continents. Each document was a bullet in the chamber of justice I'd loaded through the long night, awaiting its target with cold certainty. Board members began filtering in, their morning pleasantries dying on their lips as they sensed the unusual tension in the air. I'd positioned James strategically at the far end of the room, his medical credentials prominently displayed on the presentation screen. The sight of him, Caroline's living legacy, would be the first crack in Sarah and Tom's composure. My phone vibrated one final time with Sarah's message: "Stuck in traffic, darling. Save me a seat." The casual domesticity of her words sent a wave of nausea through me, remembering how many morning meetings had begun this way, how many times I'd smiled at her lateness, oblivious to the viper I'd welcomed into my life. The elevator chimed its arrival, and I felt their presence before I saw them, Sarah and Tom, entering together despite having claimed to be coming from different locations. The synchronicity of their movements betrayed years of intimate choreography, a dance of deception performed so long it had become unconscious. "Michael," Sarah's voice carried its usual honey warmth as she approached, arms outstretched for our customary morning embrace. The act of stepping back, of denying her this small victory, felt like shattering a chain that had bound me for years. The flash of uncertainty in her eyes was almost beautiful. "Please, take your seats," I said, my voice carrying an authority that made several board members straighten in their chairs. "We have much to discuss, and time has become a rather precious commodity." The irony of those words, time, the very thing they'd stolen from Caroline, was not lost on me. Tom settled into his chair with practiced ease, but I caught the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his water glass. "Mike, about our conversation last night." "Yes, let's talk about conversations," I interrupted, clicking to the first slide. Caroline's face filled the screen, not the hospital photo they expected, but an earlier one, from the days when she'd first begun investigating the Meridian Project. "Let's talk about the conversations my late wife was having before her unexpectedly rapid decline." The color drained from Sarah's face so quickly it was almost comical. "Almost. Michael, I don't understand what." "The human body," I continued, nodding to James, who stood and approached the screen with professional detachment, "is an intricate system of checks and balances. When those balances are disturbed, say, by the introduction of carefully calibrated chemical compounds, the disruption can mimic natural disease progression. Isn't that right, Dr. Harrison?" The use of James's title, the formal acknowledgement of his expertise, landed like a physical blow. Sarah's manicured nails dug into the armrests of her chair as my son began his clinical dissection of her methodology. "The compounds found in my mother's tissue samples," James stated, his voice steady despite the emotion I knew churned beneath, "match those tested in the Meridian Project's unauthorized trials. The progression rate, the specific markers, it's a fingerprint, unique and damning." Tom's attempt at dismissive laughter died in his throat as I clicked through to the laboratory footage, not the historical video, but the recent one. "This was filmed last week," I announced to the stunned boardroom. "The same compounds, the same methodology. The Meridian Project never ended, it just went underground. Our company's legitimate developments have been providing cover for something far more sinister." The next hour unfolded like a symphony of destruction, each revelation a carefully timed movement in the collapse of their elaborate facade. Financial records spiraled across the screen, connecting shell companies to chemical shipments, unauthorized trials to mysterious deaths. The board members' expressions shifted from confusion to horror to outrage as the full scope of the deception became clear. Sarah's composure cracked first. "You don't understand," she burst out, her voice raw with desperation. We were creating something revolutionary, a way to influence health outcomes without detection. The applications, the potential profit. The potential for murder, I cut in, my words slicing through her justification like a blade. For genocide marketed as development. For killing my wife when she discovered your true purpose. As if summoned by my words, a final email notification appeared on the presentation screen, another message from Caroline's dormant account, timed perfectly to this moment. The subject line read simply, "The final proof." Tom lunged for his briefcase, but security was already moving in, their presence a testament to the preparations I'd made through the night. As they were led from the room, Sarah turned back, her mask finally shattering to reveal the stranger beneath. "You were never supposed to discover this," she hissed, all pretense of love evaporating like morning dew. "You were supposed to remain the grieving widower, the trusting fool. The man you could control," I finished for her, feeling a cold satisfaction as the doors closed on her fury. But Caroline made sure that man died with her. What rises in his place? Well, you're about to find out. In the aftermath of revelation, silence holds its own kind of power. Standing in Caroline's old garden as the evening sun painted the roses in shades of blood and gold, I felt the weight of transformation settling into my bones like molten steel cooling into its final form. The man I had been, trusting, malleable, blind, had burned away in the crucible of truth, leaving something harder and more definite in his place. The events of the morning had unfolded with the precision of a master clockmaker's design. Caroline's final email had contained what we'd needed most, her own carefully documented investigation, complete with recordings of conversations between Sarah and Tom that stripped away their last pretenses of innocence. The board's horror had crystallized into unanimous action, and now, 12 hours later, the machinery of justice ground forward with inexorable purpose. "The FBI just confirmed," James said, joining me in the garden that his mother had loved so dearly. "They found the lab exactly where Mom's files said it would be." Sarah's not talking, but Tom. He paused, a grim satisfaction playing across his features. Tom's singing like a choir boy. I traced my fingers across a rose petal, remembering how Caroline would spend hours here, finding peace among the thorns. Had she known, even then, that she was cultivating not just flowers but the seeds of her own vindication? "He's admitted to everything," James continued. "The original Meridian trials, the systematic testing on unsuspecting communities, the chemical cocktail they perfected on Mom, and the others." The others. The word landed like a stone in still water, ripples of implication spreading outward. Sarah and Tom's ambitions hadn't ended with Caroline. We'd discovered 3 more suspicious deaths in our executive ranks over the past decade, all potential obstacles to their expansion of the testing program, all written off as natural causes. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Sarah's requesting to speak with you. Says she has information you need to hear." A younger version of myself, the man I'd been just days ago, might have wavered, might have been tempted by the possibility of understanding her motivations. But that man had died alongside the last of my illusions. "Let her keep her secrets," I replied, watching a bee navigate the complex architecture of a rose bloom. "She'll have plenty of time to share them with federal prosecutors." James settled onto the garden bench, his father's son in every line of his bearing. "The board's emergency session is scheduled for tomorrow. They want you to take permanent control as CEO." I nodded, having expected this. The company would need a steady hand to navigate the coming storms, to ensure that every trace of Sarah and Tom's poison was extracted from its operations. But first, there was something more important to address. "Before that," I said, "we have a promise to keep to your mother." Together, we walked to the small corner of the garden where Caroline had spent her final days, when the hospital could do no more and she'd insisted on coming home. The rose bushes here were different, white blooms that glowed like stars in the gathering dusk. James helped me dig, our hands working in sync until we uncovered what Caroline had buried here 12 years ago, a sealed titanium case, protected from the elements by her foresight. Inside, we found what she'd promised in her final email, the original research documents from before the Meridian Project was corrupted, showing its potential for healing rather than harm. She didn't just expose their crimes, James breathed, examining the papers with a doctor's understanding. She preserved the possibility of redemption. The discovery would take months to fully unravel, years to implement properly. But Caroline had seen beyond vengeance to something more profound, the chance to transform a weapon into a cure, to build something genuine from the ashes of deception. As night settled over the garden, I felt Caroline's presence more strongly than I had in years. Not as a ghost of grief, but as a partner in justice, her brilliance reaching across time to ensure that truth would eventually triumph over treachery. The company's annual charity gala is next month, James remarked, carefully returning the documents to their case. The same event where Sarah first. Where this all began, I finished. I think it's time we renamed it. The Caroline Harrison Foundation for Medical Ethics has a certain ring to it, don't you think? The gesture would be more than symbolic. Using the recovered funds from Sarah and Tom's schemes, we would establish a watchdog organization dedicated to preventing similar abuses in medical research. Caroline's legacy would live on not just in exposed corruption, but in protected innocence. My phone lit up one final time, a message from an unlisted number that could only be Sarah, using her last remaining burner phone. "You have no idea what you've done, Michael. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed." I smiled into the gathering darkness, feeling the last pieces of my transformation lock into place. "No, Sarah," I murmured, deleting her message without response. "You never knew what I could do." Caroline did. And now, finally, so do I. The roses swayed in the evening breeze, their thorns glinting like tiny warnings in the last light of day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, investigations to oversee, reforms to implement, a company to rebuild. But tonight, in this garden where truth had waited patiently to bloom, I finally felt free of the web of lies that had ensnared me for so long. James touched my shoulder, his presence a bridge between past and future. "Mom would be proud," he said simply. "No," I corrected him gently, "she counted on it. And that makes all the difference." Together, we walked back toward the house, leaving the garden to its secrets and its promises. Behind us, Caroline's white roses glowed in the moonlight like beacons of truth in a darkened world, their thorns standing ready to protect what mattered most, the legacy of a woman who refused to let death itself stand in the way of justice.